Welcome. I'm glad to see that that everybody stayed around from the break. We've got. I don't want to couch this too much. We got a pretty boring topic going on here today. Truth, decay, managing fake news, public opinion. I don't know if anybody watched any news this weekend or today, but there's not much happening in the world. So I guess we're going to talk about hockey, right?
Oh, I'd love to talk about hockey. Is
Excellent.
that possible? Yeah.
Excellent.
I mean,
No, actually, I'm so pleased to be here with Daniel Sieberg. He's got a very, very fascinating background that I think our challenge today is what topics do we actually focus on? Came out of school, was a broadcast journalist. A lot of the outlets that you would expect to see, CNN, ABC, CBS, MSNBC, I'm sure his college video program there. Lots of journalism from there. Then he went to this little tech company called Google. Anybody ever heard of Google, use their product? So, but he had kind of an interesting role there at Google. It wasn't just getting us all addicted to the algorithm, but it was really thinking about Google News and how it could serve journalists and where that framework. And I think as you look at that kind of intersection of technology, of the reporting, of those different aspects, oh, by the way, he's written a book or two, so you can definitely get his book there. And he said, wow, why don't we create something completely new? So he helped co-found the Civil Media Company, which is a startup based here in Brooklyn. Traditional things you would expect from media, blockchains, tokens, currency, right? Who used blockchain today? Nobody used blockchain today? Just us. Okay. So I guess before we get started, for me it's fascinating as I think about just the last 48 hours of real news, fake news, real news that seems like fake news. Ambassador Rodman in Singapore. Very pleased to have him represented. And then there was this little thing today that some small media company said it was going to buy another media company. So I guess with that as our playground, where would you like to start?
we could go in a lot of different directions, Steve. So thank you for having me here today, and it's good to be with you all. And I think we've built in some time for questions
we have, yes.
later too, so would love to answer those. So yeah, it's interesting when you talk about, people use the term fake news, and of course it's part of the panel description here today, or the interview description. We at Civil, and we can get into kind of what Civil is and how to think about it, we struggle with that term, right? So we like to think of it as misinformation, or something is just flat out wrong, right? So I think the term fake news has been co-opted by a certain segment of the population to kind of stand for everything you don't like. So if it goes against your system of beliefs, or something that you don't feel good about or comfortable with as your sort of point of view on the world, it's easy to identify something as fake news and kind of put it aside. I think when you characterize something a bit more sharply as misinformation or wrong, it starts to feel a bit more like something we need to address very specifically, rather than something that feels a bit, oh, how do you tackle fake news? Because it just seems to be tossed around all over the place. But if we were really to drill into specifically what we're both talking about, I think it's that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I could go in so many different directions. This is the danger you're going to see. I could talk. So you'll have to keep me focused on things. But yeah, and by the way, that is me. I don't know if people can see that picture. That was before having children, just to be clear. So it's for any parents in the room, there's a transformation that happens as you age. But so I did spend about 20 years in news. I was a reporter at the Vancouver Sun, hence the connection to hockey and to Canada. I spent time at CNN as a technology editor there, looking at the new editing and publishing the news around technology, science. Went on to be a correspondent at CNN covering those topics, and I did a master's degree in journalism with a focus in technology. So basically what I'm sort of trying to get across is that this kind of intersection of journalism and technology has always been at the forefront of my mind. I was the editor of our high school yearbook, right? So this is the only thing that I can think about, and here we are with Civil. So.
Well, you think of the pace of change, and I'll never forget my first day as a PR professional. I had an office. It's like, wow. I had a phone. It's like, wow. And they said, here's your first assignment. call up the bureau chief for Business Week and get him to cover our client. I thought, wow, this world is remarkably easy. I'm at this PR agency. It wasn't this one, by the way. Although that is a good first assignment for everybody's first day. And I remember dialing up, and I got this, back in those days, you know, the number dial. So it said, if you are from a PR agency, press 1. I thought, oh, this is great. I got the hotline right in.
Yeah.
And then I get
Making
this,
it so easy for you.
then I get
Just,
this
yeah.
message. All news received will be reviewed on a timely basis, and if we're interested, we'll get back to you. Click. And then I hear the dial tone.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow. All right. So then I did the next logical thing, because I wanted to go after this bureau chief. I typed something up, and I used this thing called an envelope, right? And I put this paper thing in an envelope, and I sent it, and I waited a week, and I followed up. Fortunately, it was a good pitch, so we were able to get some mention on that. But you have that versus just the pace of the news cycle today, which I saw something the other day which they said it's no longer a 24-hour news cycle, it's a blur. So if we're dealing in this blur, how do you launch an entirely new media concept in the blur and have anybody pay attention?
Wow. Yes. So great way to kick things off, I think. And you know, you know, when I was a journalist, I was a correspondent for the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric when she was there at the network, and I would, you know, do stories for the Evening News, and in theory, the data would say 5 million people were watching the program, something like that, 5 or 6 million. I would say that I heard from about 3 or 4, right? And I think that kind of what you're speaking to, and the same thing would maybe go for PR people or people who are pitching a story, that kind of opacity that surrounds a lot of news organizations and sort of breaking through that can be difficult from the outside, whether you're a viewer, a citizen, a consumer, or you're somebody, a professional who's actually trying to reach out to these news organizations. So part of what we started with, to kind of transition to your question, is thinking about the transparency that we could try to create in this ecosystem that we're building, so that there is much more of a direct citizen to journalist or citizen to newsroom pathway, that there is an opportunity to, in a way, sort of take out the middle person, if you will. I mean, and we can get into all sorts of ways that we see legacy publishers being involved in our ecosystem, tech companies like Google. This isn't about trying to remove somebody from the equation. Even advertisers we could possibly see someday on our platform, maybe, sort of, kind of, we'll see. But there's a way to kind of think about this. It's more in service of the community and the citizen rather than the other way around. And I think we've all seen examples of business models that have been failing for one reason or another. And this, I think, amplifies the tension and the concern for newsrooms, and they start to sort of feel a bit buttoned up, and they're a bit afraid to open up what they're doing.
So you talk about really connecting the citizens with the news in that framework, but wasn't that what social media was supposed to do, right? Everybody's a citizen journalist. I've got a smartphone. I can post to Twitter. I can post to LinkedIn. Heck, I can even create my own blog. How is what you're doing different?
Yeah, I think what we saw, and you know, as somebody who wrote a book called The Digital Diet, which was all about basically being overwhelmed by social media, by technology, needing to find a better, my own sort of personal self-help strategy, partly driven by my wife, who got fed up with the way that I was consuming technology and ignoring people around me, and it was just a problem. So I developed this, just kind of my own ethos around this and how to think about it, and then it turned into the book. But you're right, social media has the rise of it, and let's call it, you know, the past 10 years, really, since social media has kind of become such an integral part of our lives, and we don't even really think about the absence of it anymore. But that we sort of opened the spigot, if you will, and then and everybody who was in the tech space was like, you know, the internet, free speech, right? So free speech, everybody can push out their thoughts. It was like a big public square, right? Just everybody can say whatever they want. And of course you had the choice as a citizen to listen or not listen or ignore it or whatever you wanted to do. Of course that also started to create these filter bubbles where everybody's just in their world of whatever they're comfortable with, right? So I think what we're trying to do, and this is where I can get into some of crypto economics and how we think this can help, but is to allow the community to, of course, express their opinion, to the newsrooms that are part of the civil ecosystem, to allow newsrooms to publish freely, but to create a governance, not unlike what we know today in our society, and I can kind of get into that as well, but that holds newsrooms and publishers accountable. And not us as the civil media company, but quite literally the community, and by extension, to sort of put more of a precise definition on that, civil token holders. Okay. So we can kind of walk down that path of tokens and cryptoeconomics at any point, but really if you think of civil as a cooperatively owned platform, not trying to fold everybody into a website, can get into all of that. And the last thing I'll say, just as like a mental model to think about what we're trying to do, if you took everything you didn't like about journalism today, so social media that's kind of gone awry, trolls, bad actors, broken business models, all that stuff, right? And just put it in a box for a second. And then imagine starting all over again with a platform that's in service of journalism, period. Now, there are tons of things that have to be built in order for that to become a reality. We are not the ones who are going to be able to do all that. We're a 23-person company, but we're never going to be able to, of course, feed this ecosystem ourselves, and nor should we. So we're trying to figure out a way to include as many of the journalistic partners, organizations, publishers, et cetera, in this ecosystem to service what we're calling our civil constitution, which lays out the framework for what we're about.
So ecosystem in service of society and the community, the First Amendment, certainly something we need. And you talk about the ecosystem, but there are other things that hit that ecosystem. If I can have the next slide, please. Just wanted to get your reaction to something. I'm a big fan of models. And I've really been kind of struggling with the topic, like what we were talking about, is what is fake news and what is propaganda? So if you look at the model, if you start on the left, there's news, right? There's hardcore news that we can all agree is news. There's propaganda, which traditionally has been defined of kind of selectively choosing facts or different aspects to support an agenda or a political platform. There's fake news, which is basically uncorroborated information, sources, things like that. And then there's Bigfoot, Mary's Loch Ness, and Secret Ceremony, right? And there used to be such clear distinction that it felt like there was news, all right, there was the spin machine, and then there was that really funny thing that you read at the grocery market counter. But we asked a survey, it was more than 500 US adults, basically, what they would call a news story that selectively uses information for political effect, and here's what we found. Interestingly enough, I would argue it's a fairly classic definition that more than half would say, well, if you use it for a political effect, it's basically propaganda. I expected to see those numbers a lot higher in terms of fake news. 9% said they just thought it was funny. 16% said, hey, if it comes out of a credible publication, it's real news. I mean, what's your reaction seeing those numbers?
I think it's it's really interesting, I'm going to try to not go off on a tangent here, but I was just meeting with some journalists who are looking to create a newsroom based in Ukraine, where they are faced with very real threats of censorship, of course, but also people in Ukraine and by extension, of course, in Russia, are bombarded with propaganda, the sort of Pravda way of just brainwashing people essentially and overwhelming them with information in a very Orwellian way. That's sort of all they can think about, and trying to pierce that to provide independent information that people has veracity and is qualitative and so on is an incredible challenge. So just to kind of think, we have that challenge here in the United States, of course, but in other countries this is even more sort of amplified. So one way to think about what we're doing, and I'll kind of so for folks who have a computer or a laptop or a smartphone, so our first round of newsrooms, so what we call our first fleet of newsrooms, has started publishing this week. So if you search for a newsroom called Sludge, Read Sludge, I think is their domain, readsludge.com. Another one is Block Club Chicago, blockclubchicago.org. There's one called Documented. These are all independent news startups, essentially, that came to us last year when we called out local, policy, investigative, and international as areas of reporting that we felt were most threatened by the current broken business models. So we received $5 million in funding last year from a group called Consensus, which Consensus is the venture studio attached to Ethereum, Ethereum being the world's second largest blockchain cryptocurrency, okay? So we carved out $1 million of that, $5 million, to fund these startups, the new startups that applied to join our platform. We are basically a startup funding other startups, okay? So we granted that money to these startups and we called these out and we had to vet these newsrooms for all sorts of things. I mean, we were trying to account for diversity, inclusion. These are journalists who have a track record. You know, what are they trying to accomplish? What's their charter? We're trying to become a decentralized company where in the future we're not determining who's part of our platform. It's the community that's doing that. But in a supply and demand challenge with any platform, we need to create the supply before we can pull in the demand, right? Yeah. So I'm going to get back to your question here in just a second. But so all of these newsrooms, well, they will start to publish. So today, Block Club Chicago, they are the, I want to say remnants. That makes them sound like they're in some sort of dire state. But for people who remember DNA Info, which was a local news site, there's one here in New York, in Chicago. Joe Ricketts, billionaire owner, basically shut them down at the end of last year, pulled the funding out, and all of those journalists lost their jobs. For a time, even that archive of content was removed from the internet. So if you really paid attention to what they were writing about, and a lot of it was quite hyper-local news, all of that archive was gone. So one of the things that the blockchain allows for is a permanence of publishing. So I can kind of get into how and why that works, but essentially an analogy might be, there's no way to retrieve every copy of the newspaper that gets distributed on a daily basis, right? It's just out there in the world. There's no way to pull them all back. Same way to think about publishing to blockchain. This is just a decentralized, distributed, huge network of tens of thousands of computers, and there's a copy of all of the stories across the blockchain, okay? So each of these newsrooms has started publishing, or they will start publishing. And in order in the future for a newsroom to join our platform or to apply, they will need to do 4 things, okay? They will need to state the charter of their newsroom. So what are they about? Who are their journalists who are contributing to this, as much as you know, and will share. This is all, again, transparent to the community. They need to say that they'll adhere to our civil constitution, okay? So you can read our constitution, by the way. It's up for public comment. It's been reviewed by about 50 academics and journalists. But it's like a terms of service for journalism, okay? So, yep, I'll adhere to that. And they have to stake a certain number of civil tokens. Right now we're saying about 1,000 civil tokens. So enough to dissuade frivolous people from applying to join, but enough to make you think like, okay, I gotta be serious about this because I'm putting these at risk, because if I violate the civil constitution and a civil token holder challenges me successfully, not only can I lose all of those civil tokens, but I could potentially be deplatformed, okay? So in this way, just now I'm coming back to your question here, sorry. In terms of people's perception or optics of what is propaganda, what is fake news, how does anybody read something and think to themselves, I believe this or I don't? What we're trying to set up is a community-vetted platform where if you see somebody publishing within civil, or you see it runs on civil or the civil protocol, you start to think, I can trust this content because it's being held accountable by the community, not by us as a civil media company. We play no role in this once we've established this initial supply, but that the community starts to decide exactly what you're describing here.
You know, and that's a pretty consistent theme that we've heard from today, and I'm going to just kind of jump to the big question. I wanted to pull this quote out, but you know, I'm a firm believer that we need a very strong First Amendment. We need a very strong news, and the other findings we had in the survey were talking about that basically about 80% of people felt that they had seen fake news in their feeds. I would argue, I don't know what the other 20% were doing when this election happened from that standpoint. Most people that shared it wasn't a huge number. Generally, you know, they didn't know it was fake news. But we had there were 2 things here that I thought were interesting. One, when we were asking what is fake news, and 84% of U.S. adults agreed with this idea that an article that is fabricated with no verifiable facts, sources, and quotes. Right? That's pretty good. The second one, and you guys can just move along to the big question if you want, but the second one, which I thought was fascinating, 37% of the US public said that an article that contains factual errors, even if the mistakes are unintentional, could qualify for fake news.
Okay.
So when you talk about creating a universe where, and again, I want to get into the mechanics of the system here in a little bit,
Yep.
but you're really empowering a broader range of journalism than has ever been done. How do you make sure that the facts are verified? How do you make sure they're adhering not just to your Constitution, but to the foundational principles of good journalism?
So great question, and I think that, I often think of people, so as somebody who's been just like immersed in journalism for as long as I can remember, when I read a story, I come to it probably with a slightly different methodology than a lot of people, because the average citizen or consumer just maybe looks at content and they have to grapple with the authenticity of it or the accuracy of it for whatever ways that they have to do that, right? And it's not always easy for people to understand that. I mean, news organizations are only in recent years thinking of very clearly identifying the difference between an op-ed and an analysis piece and a story, right? I mean, if you look at a lot of the content that's shared on social media, first of all, I can bet that if you did another survey question, ask people if they actually read the story and not just the headline of the story, that's a leap for a lot of people who just see it and share it and don't even process the story, right? So there's actually a startup called Really Reddit that is rewarding people. They're a startup, so they're rewarding people with pizza, by the way. But they're rewarding people. They're trying to think of the right way to incentivize people to actually read the story before they share it, right? So to even get that far, I think, can be a leap for some people. And then in terms of assessing, the validity of, facts or somebody's opinion or something's right or wrong, there are organizations that we're talking to and hopefully working with around, and we're actually including this in some of our CMS and publishing tools, things like credibility indicators. So was this reporter on the ground when they reported this story? Where did they get the data from exactly? Again, opening up these sort of transparency pathways between the audience. Now, there's certainly, I think we can all agree that there's a segment of the population. You could throw as many transparency, facts, everything else in front of them, and sort of no amount of that is going to help. So I think that there's a lot that can be done even further upstream, if you will, around media literacy. There's a group called the News Literacy Project, which is working with high school students, and even just around things like critical thinking, which I think is sometimes sort of a lost art, frankly, in terms of how people evaluate and value content.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I'm fascinated and somewhat disheartened sometimes when you'll see national publications reporting on what is trending in somebody's social media feed, right? And particularly in an age where whenever somebody has a customer service issue, somebody's got the camera, they're wrong, they should be fired. And you get this whole bubbling up of things, some real, some not. But everybody has a responsibility. I think journalists have the responsibility to set the proper context in that framework. I agree with you. We certainly need a degree of literacy in terms of news and critical thinking, which I think as you look at a news concept like yours could bring. And what's interesting, as we look at the different speakers that we had today, the last one, the Young Turks, was basically talking about they don't have subscribers, they have members, they have a voice in the platform. Somewhat unapologetic in terms of their viewpoint and what they're doing, but they want to adhere to really good journalism. And then I just found this quote absolutely fascinating by Mark Lacey, the national editor of the New York Times. And he said the New York Times business model has changed. It's more subscription than advertising. We need engaged readers who believe in what we are doing. Isn't that what you guys are trying to do?
Yeah.
And if that's what you're doing, is the expansion team going to take out the powerhouse here?
Well, I should say, off the record, we've been talking to the New York Times. We've been talking to, insert publisher here, right? Yep. So we've been having a lot of different conversations with different news organizations to think about how and why legacy publishers or legacy brands may want to hitch their wagon to what we're up to, and that's more broadly blockchain and crypto economics, but civil. And I just want to talk about the membership thing for just a second, but it occurred to me when we're talking about people's perception of a story, and I think you said something like, if people see like one thing is wrong, you know, it starts to send signals, or like everyone else is wrong, right? Or I don't trust this. Trust, right? So fascinating. And so I think one of the struggles that I can recall as a practicing journalist, and for journalists today, and the difference between, and having spent several years at Google, and so to compare that to the journalism industry, journalists have this intense pressure to get it right? The first time you publish it, you can't crowdsource the facts, right? You can't, well, I'm going to publish this and then ask everybody if I kind of got it right later. You have to get it as right as you possibly can in an established news organization, right? And that's your reputation, that's the brand's reputation. This is why I can remember having a front page story in the Vancouver Sun, and I misspelled somebody's name like by one letter, and I was horrified, and it was my fault, and I never stopped hearing about it from our assistant managing editor, like to that degree of getting things right. Now, compare that to Google or any big tech company that launches new stuff all the time and is always touting things like experimentation and fail fast and just get out there, iterate, better done than perfect, all this stuff, right? This wonderful ethos within the tech community. That is very hard to reconcile with an industry that prides itself on getting things right. And so the idea of just experimenting or trying a new way to reach an audience or trying this thing, that thing, is a bit out of the mindset of a lot of people who are in journalism because it feels scary. So, okay, so just I want to go back to your question about, so one thing about Young Turks, if Young Turks came to us, and I've talked to Jenkin, he does amazing stuff with Young Turks, and they've got they've been around for a while. But if they came to Civil and said, we'd like to start a newsroom on Civil, we'd say, great, whatever you want to do, however you want to monetize, because through our business center, you can monetize through a subscription, a paywall if you'd like. So if the New York Times wants to experiment with that, great. If they want to do a membership model, a bit more like The Guardian or public radio, fine. If you want to do micropayments, great. Whatever it is towards sustainability, they can do. But I think that the Young Turks, and because they've been around, this is maybe a bit easier for them, but there's no sense that people are going to read their content and expect anything other than what they've been, right? So in the CNN world, an apple is an apple, right? The Young Turks are whatever fruit they are, right? They and they make no bones about that, and it's very clear. I think the difficulty for audiences is when that is not clear to them. If a news organization is trying to present itself as, this thing or that thing or in service of journalism, and then people find out that they're somehow being manipulative or they're not being authentic and in service of journalism. So I think this is what we're trying to do. That's why the news startups who have come to us for now, we're asking to create this transparency. So if somebody wants to challenge them, it can't be because we don't like your politics or we don't like you or what you stand for. You must very specifically violate the Constitution. And by the way, the Constitution, just like the US Constitution, can be amended. It can be changed. There's going to be a 365-day period where our Civil Journalism Council, which just this week we announced that Vivian Schiller will be the CEO of our Civil Foundation. She comes from being the CEO of NPR. She was at NBC as an executive, at the New York Times, at CNN, et cetera. So the Civil Journalism Council will be this oversight body that ensures that all of this is in service of the Constitution.
So you're saying you guys have thought about this a little bit?
People smarter than me have given a lot of thought to the governance.
There is, if you go to their website, they do explain the framework, and they do explain blockchain and how that's fitting in, and the cryptocurrency, and how you can support newsrooms and journalists and issues. And I guess, I promise you, I will open it up to questions. But my last question to you before we open it up, we've got a room full of a lot of corporate communicators. They're really looking at how can they be good stewards for their brand, how can they further their company's reputation. Pretty much everybody I've talked to in the senior communications roles values the free press and what needs to be done. So what is the best way for the corporate communicators in this room to engage with you? Is it to buy citizen coins? Is it to let you be? Is it to support local journalists? What is the best thing with your captive audience here today that they can do to help ensure the success of good journalism and ventures like yours?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer that question. I mean, I feel like it's all of those things and maybe more. I would say that for anybody who cares about journalism, this is where we are selling our civil token, okay, in about 3 weeks, God willing. But that's the opportunity to, in our minds, to literally hold a piece of the future of journalism, because the token has a utility purpose to it that enables this governance structure to work. You do not need to own a civil token to compensate a newsroom. That will all be done with, we're partnering with Stripe, okay, so e-commerce, and we're not taking a piece of those transactions. So if you find a newsroom on Civil, and someday we see thousands of newsrooms on Civil, right? So think of eBay or Airbnb or any other platform. This is the kind of ecosystem we're trying to create. And by the way, developers coming in to service all of these newsrooms to create whatever tools they need to be successful. That's where kind of like Apple, so if you think of Apple and the App Store, Apple creates the weather app, iOS, and then they say, okay, developers, here's an SDK, here's everything you need, go create other weather apps. So of course they do. Most of them are better than the Apple's weather app. Apple's like, great, we'll take a piece of those transactions, and they keep luring developers into their ecosystem. We see the same thing happening with Civil, and that's where our business model starts to sort of take off. There are other things around enterprise clients that we're working with and so on, but we're not getting between a newsroom and a citizen. So in that way, for folks in this room, I sense that if you're here, you care about journalism. This is where there's an opportunity. Yes, of course, that's to be transparent. We're trying to raise money, so this is part of what we're doing. But we have earmarked this money. We've already announced for the Civil Foundation, which is what Vivian will be leading. We've also announced Civil Studios, which is our for-profit entity that will be investing in journalism projects of all kinds, documentaries, startups, all kinds of stuff, right? And we're super excited. I can get into even that if people are interested. Civil Labs, which is going to be about R&D and experimentation, and we want to help to fuel just like the next generation of whatever journalism looks like. So in this way, I think just people here have that opportunity, if I can be a bit of a salesman for a second. But in terms of contributing or participating in that ecosystem, I'll give you just a little bit of kind of behind the scenes here. We have wrestled a lot with the idea of a sponsored newsroom, right? So a brand that comes in that would like to create a newsroom, which of course happens every day in different publications for sponsored content or native advertising or whatever you want to call it, but that there's content that is somehow sponsored by or produced by another entity. You could even, I think you could extend that argument even to NPR, public radio, where you hear that this program was brought to you by Exxon or whoever, right? I think the difference is NPR, public radio, is clearly telling you that this is where the source of that funding came from. So I don't know that we've landed exactly on where that opportunity is. We might even let the community decide this sort of thing. But that transparency, as long as the audience and the citizen knows where's the money coming from, what is motivating this reporting, then I think there's an opportunity there, but we haven't quite settled on it.
Well, and that's where I think the self-governance and those framework are fascinating. So I do want to open it up. Cryptocurrencies, blockchains, how you can engage with new news platforms. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious, how would you categorize some of the downsides of the decentralized model? You threw out the example of, like physical copies of newspapers, you're not able to bring them all back, but that also means you're not able to issue retractions or corrections, which seems like a fairly important part of, any sort of newsroom model.
Yep. So I'm happy to address
Totally,
that's a great
yeah.
question, and I think that you're right. There's sort of, in some ways, there's a double-edged sword with this, right? Because blockchain is distributed and decentralized, and once a piece of content has been pushed to the blockchain, there is no way to remove it or erase it. What we want to make possible for people is if you come to a newsroom in the future on Civil, you will have access to their log, okay? So you could see if they've updated a story or corrected it. It's not going to be front and center. This is something you would have to seek out as a citizen to say, oh, I see where this kind of paper trail is of versions, or they made a correction. They may also state that, depending on their own charter, that they need to make that publicly clear on their site. Hey, we had an error here and we've updated it and you should know that, and here's where you can go find that if you want to. and just to kind of, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but newsrooms will have the option to push to the blockchain. So in sort of the traditional world, you know, when you have a CMS and you publish content, it goes to an AWS or a cloud-based server, right? And then we all experience the content through the web. So that's what our current newsrooms are doing. So that minimizes the latency and gives people the experience we've all come to, you know, become accustomed to, right? Because the reality is to push content to the blockchain takes some time. You know, for anybody who's followed this space, verifying transactions in this way, it just doesn't happen instantaneously. This is part of the scaling challenge of any blockchain. That will, I think, be solved over time, but for now, it's a little bit problematic. And just to put a sort of a final point on this, there is a fee associated with pushing content to the blockchain. So this is called gas. So in the Ethereum terms, right? So because the part of the way that this whole model works is that a blockchain is just people donating their computing power, essentially. Now, this could be like a really formalized network of computers and supercomputers, but it could also just be like people at home donating their computer. So they have to be compensated for that. So that's where these fees go. We've estimated it's around 90 cents for a 1,200-word article. So not huge, but not insignificant. The good news is those costs are going to start to come down, in theory, as this all starts to scale and so on. And the last thing I'll say is that for a journalist, it's a little bit scary to think that whatever you publish will be there for anybody to see, right? Just calling it out as a human nature thing. You know, I'm not the first one to admit I made mistakes. As a journalist, I'd like to say there were very few, but I did. And at times, you know, a few times there had to be a correction. It was the most humiliating moments of my career was for there to be a correction. And that started out with print. This is even before there was an electronic version. And I would argue that it's too easy for a lot of publishers to correct something without anyone knowing about it. So there's a lot of that happens in the dark. And that happens at even legacy publishers, I'm sorry to say, that they change things in a story with a version or this, and they just don't tell anybody because they don't think it's significant. Well, who determines that was significant or not? Right. So I just think that there's an opportunity on both sides, but I thank you for the question.
Or they just put at the very bottom, this article is updated on, and they give it time.
Yeah, updated, right, exactly.
What about this side of the room? Any questions? Anybody ready to donate your computer for Civic?
Some mining. We don't have any mining, to be clear. We have a finite number of civil tokens that will only ever be available, so we'll only have 100 million civil tokens, and we'll be selling, I forget exactly how many, 32% or roughly 32 million during our public sale. The rest of them are being allocated for different things.
We've got a question up here.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, who will be policing your Constitution?
Yep.
And the second is, how do you explain what you're doing and your mission to someone who has no idea what cryptocurrency and was it citizen coins are?
Yep. So civil, exactly. So I'll just tell you, a year ago I knew nothing about blockchain and cryptocurrency, okay? So I spent the better part of 20 years as a science and technology reporter. I felt like I kind of knew something about all that stuff, okay? I spent 6 years at Google. So this is where I come from, right? And then out of the blue, I read a story from Neiman Labs that said Civil is going to try to figure out journalism and blockchain or something. And this is last summer. And this is how I met our CEO, named Matthew Iles, who really had the vision for this and kind of the early thinking and understood economics and entrepreneurship, and he did a journalism degree. So he was just starting to figure some of this stuff out. So all of that is to say that we're still finding the right ways to help people understand this. I mean, we've benefited from, of course, this kind of perfect storm of people's interest in blockchain and Bitcoin and fake news and misinformation and all that stuff. But I will say that Matthew's kind of genesis for this predates a lot of that. I mean, it goes back to 2016 and so on. So in a way, it's been this kind of slow burn, and now it's becoming just more a part of people's consciousness. So it continues to be a challenge. I have lots of analogies to help people think of blockchain, including pickup football, which I can anyway. But I won't. Yeah.
But as you talk through that, I guess one of the things it's interesting because you came at it very much from a technology standpoint. I grew up in a really, really small town, all 900 of us. And, you know, the struggle there was we always had the local newspaper, The Sun. that came out every week, and you knew all that framework. And my initial take when I looked at something like Civic was, wow, what a platform this gives the community newspaper or that journalist, because if they're doing a compelling piece and they're being rewarded by anybody around the world who happens to like that thing, wow. So what's this going to do to community newspaper and community journalists?
I'm so excited about that part. And by the way, I didn't forget your question about the civil constitution, but yes, I mean, so today, Block Club Chicago, so I mentioned DNA Info, right? They're the remnants of DNA Info in Chicago. Today, they have started publishing their content about Chicago. They've broken it out into neighborhoods. They've got a team of, I think, 8 or 9 journalists who've basically put their livelihoods in our hands, and they're starting to reach out to the community of Chicago. These are also people who knew nothing about all this stuff when we first started working with them, but they are now becoming more comfortable in messaging this, and the community doesn't have to care about the civil token. As long as they can get the information that they need or want, then there's a great opportunity there. And we could see thousands of those existing all over the place. And just a quick kind of, so you think of eBay, right? So eBay is a platform. And when Piero Midiar started eBay, there was a story about how somebody started selling broken laser pointers. Okay, not laser pointers.
The cats were disappointed.
Yeah, yes, right. The cats couldn't. Broken laser pointers, and the perception was, this is all a little bit nuts. Who's going to possibly buy broken laser pointers? There was somebody who bought broken laser pointers because they collected broken laser pointers. So the point is just that when you can open up, in this case, information and journalism to a global audience, even a newsroom like Block Club Chicago could potentially find people outside the community. They did a Kickstarter when they first announced their newsroom. They were trying to raise $25,000. We were a little worried. This is about 3 or 4 months ago. They ended up raising $185,000 over the course of about a week. They had to shut it down. It became the largest Kickstarter journalism project in history. So I think that's a nice example of how people really do care about this kind of thing. They just don't necessarily know where to go. And Tori, just to answer your last question about the Constitution, so the Civil Council will be made up of 9 people. So Vivian, part of her initial remit as she's come in now is to seat the council. So there are some people who will be announcing soon who will be part of this council. They will also be rotating. This isn't a life, appointment or something. They have their own sort of mandate to account for all kinds of things, including geography, diversity. They're trying to reflect the broader community and society. And they will also have 365 days to work with the community to ratify the Constitution. So it is, we call it a proto-constitution. So it's not, this is written in stone and everybody has to stick to this. There could, of course, be amendments and it could be quite organic. And they also, they can also be held accountable in this checks and balances world. If somebody appeals a decision that happens on our platform and that goes to the council and the council says, oh, you're right, it needs to be this thing, that could be overturned by a supermajority vote from the civil token community. So there's a way of thinking of how all of this kind of relates to itself. But again, ultimately, most people will never have to think about or worry about, kind of like Wikipedia, which we all use, I think. But I would love to know if anybody here is deeply involved in how it works. I have a hard time explaining exactly how it works. I mean,
you just want it to be accurate.
Yeah, you just want it to be accurate, and you've started to trust it because there are people who have committed to this, and they call out when something is either under review right? So they have aspects of transparency and trust that they've tried to build into their experience.
Well, Daniel, this has been absolutely fascinating looking at the intersection of technology and journalism. I'm sure I speak with most in this room that we could go on for another 3 hours and barely scrape the surface. So I invite you, if you have questions, to catch Daniel after we're done here today. And do check out the website and anything that you can do to support good journalism. So absolutely fascinating day today. And what I'm most heartened about what we've heard from the new startups that we have out there, reimagining exactly what good journalism could be, to the gray lady and really how that newsroom is really thinking about how do they best serve. I think we can all leave here feeling that there is a commitment to good journalism, that is a passion of a lot of people, and that the First Amendment from that standpoint is alive and well. So thank you very much for joining the 2018 Global Street Fight. Have a wonderful day.